Church and the Climate Crisis, a 5-part podcast series commissioned by the New Zealand Baptist Union. Part 4, A Heart for the Future. What is the future going to look like and how do we feel about it? Having done our overview now and looked at both scripture and science, I was really keen to hear our contributors on this question. And given that I was only just getting to know most of them, I was amazed how willing they were to share personally. I imagine a lot of us can relate to this opening comment from Auckland Eco Church coordinator Rebecca Webb.
The underwater world is still one of my favourite places to be, and running through a track in the forest is just a bit magical. This deep appreciation for nature has kind of been curated through my childhood, I think. I've now got a 2-year-old and just seeing her wonder at the world and just thinking about how different our environment is today grieves me a bit. You know, I want her to be able to experience it as I did, to see the wonder of mountains and beautiful forests and the underwater world that is untouched or has been untouched. It does sadden me thinking about what she's going to inherit and makes me really want to work hard now to do my bit to make sure that there is a world for her to inherit.
You can really feel how personal it is for Rebecca there and how motivated she is. But what can her daughter expect? We all want to be able to plan for the future, so what's going to happen when? Here are some things Katharine had to say on that.
So what's going to happen by 2050? We have to remember, whenever we see a number of what's going to happen by 2050 or what's going to happen by 2030 or what's going to happen in the future, that number depends on our choices. So what it's really saying is, if we continue our current pathway, this is what's going to happen. But if we decide to take a different pathway, we could avoid that future. And so what I personally always do when talking about the future, and this is actually my research, I do study the future, I always provide 2 pictures of the future. If we continue on our current pathway, here's how many killer heat waves we're going to have, or how much area will be burned by wildfires, or how many days your children can't play outside because of all the smoke in the air. But if we take action and do everything we can, here's what the future would look like. Which one do you want? Oh, you want that one too? All right, let's talk about solutions that will get us there.
Well, I guess we're all on the same page there. But before we line up our solutions to save our planet, it's worth keeping this in mind.
It's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun, long after we're gone. The question is, what is going to happen to us? Because this planet is just the perfect planet for life. Our food systems, our water systems are all designed for the conditions that we've had over the last few thousand years, not the conditions of rapid change. 2/3 of the world's largest cities are located within a meter of sea level. If sea level rises a meter, as it could this century if we don't take action, what will happen to all of those people, as well as half the rice growing area of the country of Bangladesh? We are perfectly adapted to the conditions of the past, and we are already today in uncharted territory.
And that being the case, we can see the importance of the work climate scientists like Katharine do to make these future projections. And someone who is dependent on those projections is World Vision's Olivia Yates. You may remember her from episode 2, where she talked about climate-related visas. Take a listen to this.
We all see the news, we hear about the wildfires that might be raging in the Amazon, or the floods that are happening in China, or the heat waves which are wiping through Europe. We know that this is only going to get worse. The way that the climate works is that the emissions we're currently putting out won't be felt for another 20 years. And so what we're experiencing now is from the actions of 20 years ago. Maybe you might think that climate change is not severe enough to push people off their homelands in the present. The 20-year impacts of how we're living our lives now are already laid down. That's going to happen. There's very little we can do about it.
Yeah.
A child born now would be 76 by the end of this century. And by 2100 in the Pacific, it's likely that different islands will be uninhabitable. And all around the world, we'll see children who are experiencing the impacts we've laid down now in the future.
Right.
It's really clear that if we are to look after children in the future, as well as in the present, we've got to think about what we're doing about the climate crisis.
It really struck me there that Olivia wouldn't be doing her job properly if she only dealt with the climate issues of today. Someone would say, "You knew this was going to happen. Why didn't you do something?" I found Olivia's comment about the impacts of today's emissions being felt in 20 years helpful too, and I asked Katharine Hayhoe if she could clarify that further.
The way I think about it is comparing it to smoking. So imagine that you've been smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for years and even decades. And you're noticing that now when you try to go out for a jog, you don't have the same lung capacity you used to. Is that because of the cigarette you had today or because of all the cigarettes you've been smoking over the last 10 years? So that's the way our emissions are affecting us. They build up in the atmosphere. And the more they build up, the greater the impact they have. And so, to continue the analogy, when's the best time to stop smoking? As soon as possible. How much? As much as possible. There's no magic number of cigarettes that, imagine if you could smoke 9,999 cigarettes and you'd be fine. But if you smoke number 10,000, you would instantaneously get lung cancer overnight. That isn't the way it works. It's the same with carbon. There's no magic number of carbon that if we produce this amount will be okay, but 1 extra ton and it's all over. No. The more cigarettes we smoke, the more carbon we produce, the worse the impacts.
So, some helpful clarifications there as we think about the future. Now what I want to do is I want to change tack to take you to an interview I was lucky to get with the co-founder of an international conservation organisation run in 26 countries by Christians. When you meet Peter Harris, it quickly starts to feel like he's a guy you've known for years. I kept thinking, is this really the guy who started a global conservation movement? What's impressive is that if you went up into space and looked down on planet Earth, you'd see 1.5 million hectares that have been transformed by Christians, working for A Rocha International, co-founded by Peter Harris. That is astounding. And I love the fact that during a time when there's been so much talk and a whole lot of hand-wringing and worrying, here is a massive group of Christians who for the last 42 years have been doing something about the problem. So, what was it 42 years ago that made Peter Harris leave his role as a church minister to start A Rocha? And did he ever think it would become the huge success it has been?
I don't really think I did leave pastoring in a way. I think once a pastor, always a pastor. But I certainly left a post in a church to go to Portugal with my wife Miranda and Les and Wendy Batty, a zoologist, and his wife, to set up the first field study centre in Bird Observatory. We had a number of motivations. One was that I was born, for better or worse, hardwired for nature and particularly birds. Miranda used to say I was born with binoculars around my neck, but none of my birding or environmental friends ever darkened the door of a church. And when I was in church, I heard nothing at all about what was clearly going to be the issue of our times, and which has since proved to be the issue of our times, I would say, which is the collapse of the biosphere. In the lifetime of A Rocha, 40 years, we've lost half of life on Earth. And this was a disconnect that we felt very profoundly in ourselves personally, and as something that we wanted to, as you say, do something about rather than write books or run conferences. All of that came a lot later on the back of years and years of fieldwork.
As the interview continued, I was amazed to find out how many Christians are doing conservation work around the world and how strongly it is connected with their faith.
It's remarkable the work that many Christians leading so-called secular conservation organizations do, and they are undoubtedly inspired by their biblical faith. In the global south, about 50% of those working in conservation organizations will be Christians in most parts of the world where biodiversity is concentrated. And for many of them, this is a faith enterprise. This is something they're doing out of their conviction. I mean, all conservation people are, if you like, people of faith in the sense that they're doing it because of beliefs, spoken or unspoken. We're just clear about our reasons. We're doing it because God loves the world more than we do, that he entrusted it to our care. And we do this as a response to that. We're not trying to save the world. We're trying to worship God in a way that does justice to his loving nature. What I do think is that we should be looking to see the good news of Jesus Christ, not just written in our own personal lives or in our communities and fractured societies, but written in the landscape, written itself in God's creation and visible. I do remember taking a very diverse group of Christian leaders up to the top of the Shuf between Beirut and the Bekaa Valley and looking down on the Bekaa Valley and saying, that looks the way it does because Christians have been working here for 20 years. And that is a beautiful thing. And a journalist from O Público, the Portuguese newspaper, came to see the peninsula and wetlands where we work in the south of Portugal and said, this is a miracle, because virtually all of the South Portuguese coast now lies under ill-advised concrete. And yet this is still a functioning ecosystem that is vital to all kinds of habitats and species, but particularly birds moving up from West Africa to the Arctic to breed. So I do think that should be our ambition. Where there are Christians, not only should the community undergo transformation, and we should live that transformation ourselves, but we should understand what the transformation of place is about and be a blessing to our places. So often Christians, whether they're running rapacious extractive industries or whatever else, have not been a blessing to God's creation. And certainly Christians who think it's all going to burn and so it doesn't matter are toxic in fragile ecosystems. We've seen that over and over again.
No beating around the bush there. Well, at this point in the interview, I started wondering what he thought about the global situation. Despite all the great work of A Rocha, the biodiversity crisis has got worse than ever. What has the emotional journey of that been like for him and his colleagues? And how do you find hope when the stats are all going the wrong way?
To speak precisely to your word, I feel hopeful. Hopeful because fundamentally the world is God's fingerwork. He loves it more than we do. And Scripture tells us in Romans chapter 8 that it has a future. It's going to be drawn into the glorious liberation of the sons of God, is what Romans 8 tells us. That gives me hope. Does that mean I'm optimistic for the trends that we have observed, all going in the wrong direction? I think without exception over the last 40 years, no, I'm not remotely optimistic. If I may, it maps onto my own personal experience, which was of catastrophe and losing my wife in a car accident just before that retirement you talked of. So that's a kind of catastrophe, but I've known the love and care of the Lord in the years of recovery. And these two things to me look remarkably similar. It's the difference between optimism and hope. Am I grieving and all of that? Of course I am. Are people who care about God's creation grieving? Of course they are. But they see ahead of them a future which ultimately rests in the character of God. I've known this because, I was dead at the crash site. There is life after death. If it's not good, it's not over. Temporally, it's catastrophic. It is. My life has been lived in catastrophe for the last few years, but I can't explain it, but the goodness of God sustains us.
What a moving testimony that was, and with the parallel there with the story of losing his wife. And it makes me wonder if we're coming to a time where Christian faith is going to mean more than ever. There's a hope that buoys and enables so many Christians around the world to do this restoring work, because by faith we can see beyond current indicators. I asked all these same questions to one of our other contributors, Wesley Webb. He took a slightly different line, following a quote we looked at together by Gus Speth, who famously said, "The biggest environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy." Take a listen.
I think it's a really insightful quote. The truth is, we know what the problem is, and we know what's needed to fix it already. We need to stop emitting greenhouse gases by divesting from fossil fuels, swapping to renewable energy. We need to rethink our farming practices. We need to stop burning the rainforest, which releases huge amounts of carbon and then takes away trees who would suck up carbon. So it's a double whammy. And then we need to suck excess carbon out of the atmosphere by preserving the ecosystems that remain intact and by planting gazillions of trees, covering as much land area as possible. So we know what we need to do. We have the technology to solve the problem. So what's the holdup? As Gus says, it's selfishness, greed, and apathy. Mega corporations don't want anything to change. And the everyday person finds personal change hard. I mean, I know for myself, just doing little changes to what I eat or trying to avoid plastic packaging, it's just hard. It's easier to just go with what you're used to. I do feel like the problem is ultimately in the human heart. The good news for the Christian is that we serve a God who can change hearts. Scientists are cursed with terrible knowledge of how messed up the world is and how urgently we need to act. And most people out there don't know and don't care as much as they should, which is a horrible feeling. We sleepwalking into a crisis, or already in the crisis, and people are just unaware. For me, this is why faith in God is so important. He's our hope. He's the antidote to despair. We know the end of the story. We know that God is going to win. He's going to restore and redeem his world. Heaven is coming, and it's unstoppable. And so for a Christian, there's always, always reason for hope.
I've got to say that when I lined up these interviews with all of these contributors, I really didn't expect to be so encouraged in my faith. I hope you are too, particularly if you're someone who's been aware of environmental issues for a while and struggling with it on your own. And as we consider the role we need to play, this comment from Katharine, where she's discussing an IPCC report on possible futures, feels particularly important.
We're seeing these changes happening around the world, and so people want information on what's happening, how bad is it going to be, and what can we do to make a difference. And so that is now what the IPCC provides. And a couple of years ago, they did a report where they compared the different futures that would result from the choices we make today. And I feel like this was incredibly useful because the number one uncertainty is the choices that we make. We are the ones who are causing this to happen in the first place. And so what we decide to do is going to affect the outcomes, our future. And what this report concluded was so simple. With, all the equations that went into it and all the physics that went into it and all the scientific studies that went into it, these were the conclusions. Every bit of warming matters, every action matters, and every choice matters. I just feel that's such a simple conclusion, such a clear conclusion, and such an empowering conclusion because it means our choices make a difference. And that isn't just in our personal lives. We have to use our voices to advocate for change because you and I, and even ourselves, our families, our churches, we could do everything we could in our personal lives, but it still wouldn't be enough. We need to change the system. But what is a system made up of other than people? And when does a system change other than when people call for it to change? I'm thinking of how was slavery abolished? It wasn't because the King of England woke up one day and decided to do it. It was because ordinary people advocated for years and even decades, and many of them were motivated by their faith. You could say the same about civil rights in the US, about apartheid in South Africa. Major societal changes were initiated by people, ordinary people, using their voices to call for and advocate for a better, fairer, and more just future. And if they did it back then, I know that we can do it today.
In line with Katharine's comments there, a number of us are starting to feel like we're living in a moment of vital opportunity. Opportunity for us as individuals and also for churches to get on the right side of this issue and make a real difference in the communities in which we are placed. We've had this problem for long enough. What is it that we can do? Well, that is the entire focus for the final podcast in this series. In 341, the climate musical, there is a point of desperation where it hasn't rained for weeks, and this is captured in a prayer that the islanders sing called The Cry of Your Children. Given the comments we've been listening to in today's session, perhaps you sense a call to prayer like they did.
Creator of tides, of the sun, moon, and stars, this Eden you made, this land you have loved. The wind and rain only rise at your command. Unleash the heavens and unfurl your hand. The valley of shadow will not end in death. I swear it, believe it, with every breath. These lives and these people, what has it all meant? If in the blink of an eye, from this world they are rent.
That was Reuben Simpson singing The Cry of Your Children from 341, the climate musical. If you're interested to come and see the show, you'll find the ticket link at toitoicollective.com. And given the importance of this climate topic, we'd love any help you can give us to tell others about it. That's us for episode 4. Catch you for the final one in the series, episode 5.
This podcast is made with the support of the Nelson Christian Trust for the Baptist NZ Podcast Network.